Well, my presentation is completely different from the previous presentation, and it will take you into a completely different era, and it's dealing with a completely different subject. It is about Tim Burton's vision of the conflict between the individual and society, with examples from two Batman films that he directed, Batman, which was released in 1989, and Batman Returns, which was released in 1982. 1992. And in his films, Tim Burton's usually highly critical of all forms of collectivity. He typically represents urban society as being prone to bouts of collective madness. For him, the media-influenced, godless, lost, easily controlled urban crowd is constantly in danger of becoming possessed by all kinds of demonic forces, political, social, or economic, or of falling prey to what Jung calls the collective shadow, the shadow of society fed by the neglected and repressed collective values. And Burton's Batman films epitomize his vision of the dangers of urban modernity, because it appears that from his point of view, an urban individual is supposed to be rational. He or she is supposed to have individual choice, but in reality he is pushed towards collective thinking and mass madness. And in his Batman films, and in his films in general, Burton paints disturbing pictures of crowd insanity. Both the Joker and the Penguin charm the citizens of Gotham City into becoming a pliable mass with one brain, only to massacre them later. And my first example is from Batman. Remember the Gotham City parade scene, in which, in fact, the Joker sums up the relationship between the crowd and its shadow by saying, and now I'm going to relieve you, useless people, of the burden of your useless lives.
Lives. But as my plastic surgeon always said, if you gotta go, go with a smile.
And in this sense, Burton's Gotham City is a microcosm of postmodern society. Victor Turner said that the ritual was specifically created to induce people to want to do what they must do. However, when the dictatorship of the custom, tradition, and religion is lifted, and the freedom of personal choice is introduced, human beings don't automatically become boundlessly free and emancipated. Throughout his career, Burton has been trying to show that, with all the enthusiasm about personal choice and uniqueness, commonness and normalization have not disappeared, and the threat to the individual remains. The absence of a fixed, prescribed official set of lifestyle rules, what Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus, doesn't necessarily mean that human beings are free. Without a fixed habitus, and with so many external influences offering alternative identities, or rather fragments of identities in its place, television, newspapers, magazines, advertisements, the shops, the internet, the subject becomes fragmented, confused, and disorientated. The true subject, the wholesome subject, is dead, and that's obviously the central debate of postmodern criticism. Any force that promises to complete him, to collect him or her from fragments, to give him or her meaning, will hold power over the subject. This is when the collective shadow comes into play. And Burton tends to portray society as a mindless herd, if you think about Edward Scissorhands, for instance, and Mars Attacks and The Sleepy Hollow. He distrusts the crowd. The crowd is mad. The crowd kills the individual. The crowd is murderous. The crowd is stupid. People, when they gather together, are incapable of thinking clearly. They think as one brain, He portrays the crowd as a collection of lost souls incapable of intellectual independence, and has constantly on the lookout for a loony leader or a mad idea to adhere to. Obviously, this is already in the Batman myth, but he likes the Batman myth precisely because of this idea that the crowd is mad. The individual, Burton seems to tell us, wants to identify with the group, seeks to identify with the group. This perception of society, which is quite aloof, that's an aloof perception of society, is very similar to Jung's elitist analysis of contemporary politics and social behavior. Reflecting on the catastrophic events of the 20th century, Jung writes that, quote, masses are breeding grounds for psychic epidemics, end of quote. Without a genuine communal base, or even where such a base is present, the survivalist herd instinct can easily turn into its own shadow. Quote, society, by automatically stressing all the collective qualities in its individual representatives, puts a premium on mediocrity, on everything that settles down to vegetate in an easy, irresponsible way. Individuality will inevitably be driven to the wall. All human control comes to an end when the individual is caught up in a mass movement because, as Jung writes in his essay Psychology and Religion, quote, there is indeed reason enough for man to be afraid of the impersonal forces lurking in his unconscious. We are blissfully unconscious of these forces because they never, almost never, appear in our personal relations or under ordinary circumstances. But if people crowd together and form a mob, then the dynamisms of the collective man are let loose, beasts or demons that lie dormant in every person until he is part of a mob. Man in the mass sinks unconsciously to an inferior moral and intellectual level, to that level which is always there, below the threshold of consciousness, to that level which is always there, below the threshold of consciousness, ready to break forth as soon as it is activated by the formation of a mass. End of quote. And there are, of course, different ways. That's a very negative view of the mass and of people who gather in a crowd. But there are different ways of looking at the herd instincts and the desire to be like everyone else, to join in with the collective identity. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz writes, for instance, that recipes, rules, and instruction exist because, quote, man is precisely the animal most desperately dependent upon such extragenetic, outside-the-skin control mechanisms, such cultural programs for ordering his behavior, end of quote. Geertz effectively advocates that human agents need culture to structure and organize their world, that the man is in need of ready-made symbols and prescribed meanings because he needs to put a construction upon the events through which he lives, because they help him, quote, to orient himself within the ongoing course of things, End of quote. Moreover, Goetz argues, without highly particular defining forms of culture, constrictive, conservative, and prison-like as they are for the individual, man is incomplete and unfinished. Human beings have psychological necessity to belong to a collective identity, quote, De Bourne or Javanese, Hopi and Italian, upper class and lower class, academic and commercial, end of quote. Only through their culture can individuals attain full completion. We can compare this to Jung's idea of individuation, because culture is there to fill the information gap between, quote, what our body tells us and what we have to know in order to function, end of quote. And he obviously means that culture fills the body with meaning as well as the soul of the individual. But that's a positive view of the mass and mass thinking and collective thinking. Burton has a completely different opinion. He's not a philosopher, he's a filmmaker, and his only way to express his opinions is via images, and that's what he does. He asserts in his films that postmodern individuals are not strong enough to sustain this kind of fragmentation. You have to be a hero like Batman to be a postmodern individual, to pull yourself together from fragments, to build your own identity. But if you are not a hero, then you will join in with the collective shadow, because subconsciously you still want to possess a collective identity. People have to be heroic, they have to become heroic. If they fail to become heroic, they join in with the collective shadow because they are mediocrities. That's his idea. Unconsciously, instinctively, they want to go back to the safety of communal existence, to return to a psychological place in which they feel whole and meaningful. But by renouncing fragmentation and returning to the community, they fall straight into the hands of the collective shadow. Instead of consistent, responsible, mature, harmonious individualism as envisaged by the paragons of Enlightenment ethics, we witness in Burton's films the tragic split between individual thinking and social obedience. From his point of view, the surface of modern society is torn, the machine is broken, and this is exactly how he represents it in his films, divided, metonymized, full of gaps and holes. Burton's version of the Joker is a cross between the playful trickster and the scary shadow. And the Joker, obviously played by Jack Nicholson, acts as a waste bin for the traits undesirable in a civilized society. The Joker is the shadow pretending to be a trickster. And the difference between the trickster and the shadow lies just in perception. The trickster becomes the shadow when people want to forget the instinctual, the dark, the unconscious, or explain it away, or repress it. The trickster stands for everything uncivilized, for anything uncivilized and instinctual. And when people try to repress it, it becomes the shadow. It comes back in the dark form. Speaking metaphorically, the trickster keeps access to the unconscious and its creative powers, while the shadow, as a split-off figure, symbolizes the blockage of morally reprehensible tendencies. And the Joker is the shadow of society that stopped laughing at itself and started taking itself too seriously.